Oh, it's a pleasure to be back here again talking to you all after not that long a break. So for those of you who prefer a straightforward title to a presentation, what we're talking about here is this. We're looking at, everyone knows that today the New Zealand is basically sitting across the plate boundary between New Zealand, the Australian and Pacific plates. And that dominates the modern tectonic region. What I'm exploring here is trying to find the records of the early stages of that plate boundaries development, trying to track down those remaining clues to how this inherited geological system adapted to that imposition of a new structural regime back in the Miocene. And as we'll see, there are some interesting ideas to come out of that to do with what happens when you hit a complex geological system with a new stress regime and how that might impact on things like fluid flow and mineralization. To start off with the take-home messages, in case anyone wants to leave early, number one, what I'm going to present to you is basically showing you a comparative analysis of different crystalline blocks in the western region of New Zealand's South Island. And what this analysis shows is that if you look at the thermal history of these blocks, you can see an otherwise cryptic record of that very early stage of evolution in the modern plate boundary. It's been lost from most of the geology of the region. You only see it remaining in these little isolated clues in the thermal history of deeply exhumed blocks in this western margin. Now, what that record shows, I'll try and demonstrate to you, is that when the system first kicked off with this modern regime of a transform boundary through southern New Zealand, it was very complex. You had a broad domain of variable structures all adapting in their own way to this new regime, some uplift, some basins forming, some strike-slip motion, very complex, very disordered structure. But rapidly, the system then evolved to the very dominant structure we see today. We have a single structure going the length of the South Island, accommodating most of the plate boundary motion along that one structural zone. So all this complexity dies away very, very rapidly. And what I want to show you is that this is basically an example of self-organization of that complex geology. And just as a teaser at the end, there are some implications for this, from this kind of behavior to think about why we see temporal clustering or temporal clustering in mineral systems. Wherever you look across the Yilgarn, if you look at gold mineralization, you see the same age, or one or maybe two ages across the Yilgarn over this whole broad region. That's not an accident. There is something about the basic character of this structural system where when you hit it with a new regime, a new of stress hitting the region, it's that very early stage when you get most of the activity and most of the interesting things going on with those structures. And this behavior I'm going to present to you here, I think, is giving us an insight into how that kind of a broad regional synchronization of mineralization can be explained. So to begin, here is a simple map of the seafloor topography around most of the world here. New Zealand, as I'm sure everyone is aware, sits here. Its modern system is dominated by the fact it's sitting on this plate boundary between the Pacific plate here and the Australian plate off to the west. So New Zealand's very active tectonically, a lot of volcanism, a lot of active earthquakes there because of it sitting on that very rapidly deforming plate boundary. Now, to take you through some brief introductory geology that we need to get through this talk, I won't bore you with too much of this. I'm sure many of the geologists in this room are probably from New Zealand, given the way the current market works. But the background to what you need to know to appreciate this talk going forward is New Zealand is basically made up of the former Gondwanan margin of eastern Australia. This used to be docked up against, well, you can argue where it was, somewhere around New South Wales, Queensland border area along the Gondwanan margin. And so what you see in the basement geology is you have part of this here is Gondwanan basement, crystalline rocks of that eastern Australian affinity over here in the west of the country. And this basically was the eastern margin of Gondwana. And so through the Mesozoic, you accreted a range of terrains to that boundary, one after the other, slamming into the boundary of the Gondwanan system. And then in the Cretaceous, this block here rifted away. So you lost that former accretionary margin of Gondwana, rifted out to the east to form the modern New Zealand system. Now, after that, when it took on its own independent character, you then see dominantly there's two main sequences. There's an early Cenozoic regressive sequence as New Zealand rifts away and sinks beneath the waves as it leaves Australia behind. And then in the early Miocene, things start to happen. There's a transformed boundary break through the New Zealand structure in that Miocene period. And it's then you see rejuvenation. You get the land comes back up out of the sea, you see a regressive sequence, tectonism, and it's this event here I'm trying to talk to here in this examination this afternoon. Now, the timing of this event is pretty well established from a range of different studies looking at sedimentology, looking at the tectonics and structure of the region. And this kicks off about 25 million years. That's when we go from that progressive sinking beneath the waves, and we start to see the rejuvenation of the New Zealand landform in the earliest Miocene. And the other event, the other time that's going to come up quite a lot today is the change from that initial period of just transform motion through the South Island here to when we see the modern regime of oblique convergence and uplift taking place. That happens about 8 million years. So there's these two major events in modern plate boundaries evolution. First of all, we see a strike slip boundary forming in the early Miocene, and that then changes to this modern oblique convergent regime with rapid uplift about 8 million years ago. And those two times are going to come up again and again today as we go through the geology we're talking about. So looking now at the geology of the South Island, which is where we're focusing in this presentation, there was quite a challenge to try to isolate that early record because of the amount of deformation and erosion you've had taking place in this modern orogenic regime. So here's the basic geology of the South Island. The main areas that are going to see us are highlighted here. The key thing is you have this plate boundary here, the Alpine fault down the length of the South Island, between the Pacific plate and the Australian plate. There's about 42 millimetres per year of relative movement between those two plates. It's oblique to the margin, and so you have a right lateral transform and a lot of convergence across that boundary, thrusting up the Southern Alps along that structure. Now, the amount of deformation and uplift give rise to difficulty in trying to isolate that early record. There's so much happening in the modern regime, it's hard to see through that to the early stages of its evolution. So basically you've had this area up here I've highlighted. This is an area of quartzo-feldspathic schist in the Nelson region. This is the same schist that you find down here in central Otago. So this has been moved along that plate boundary by about 500 kilometres by the movement on that structure. So there's a lot of transformation along that boundary there, and along with that you've had in the past 8 million years about 80 kilometres of convergence across that boundary. So 80 kilometres of crust thrust up that Alpine fault, eroded off and lost from the sequence. So you have a lot of record very deformed and eroded away, giving us an inability to see a lot of that early systems evolution. So looking at the basic kinematics of the system here, this is a view basically looking from the south here up along the plate boundary. So here's the Alpine fault dipping away to the east here. And what's happening is the Pacific plate's coming in. There's a detachment down here at about 25 kilometres depth where the Paleo-ocean crust is detaching. And so you have the upper crustal pile here of accumulated sediments. There's immature greywackies metamorphosed to green schist facies and lower and purple-like facies. This is being thrust up the Alpine fault and exposed along the boundary here at the surface. Below that, the former oceanic crust is being subducted down here and forming a deformed root down beneath the mountain. But it's quite small still. It's a very new origin. So this dynamic basically means you have on the eastern side of the Alpine fault all the high topography, the beautiful mountains there, the high ranges that capture all these glaciers and snow-capped peaks and things. But at the same time, that high topography gives rise to high erosion rate, and so you see a lot of loss of that record through that system's development. Importantly to our story, out to the west of the Alpine fault, you see there is deformation going on to do with the modern plate boundary, but at much lower rates. It's a very, very minor deformation, to the order of about 1 millimetre per year of uplift there, which is not inconsiderable, but compared to the Southern Alps themselves, it's a much lower rate. So you see a higher preservation potential out there west of the plate boundary. It's these lower hills here, these granitic mountains out to the west of the boundary, that are the focus of most of my presentation here today. And these are very important to us because there's this less intensely deformed area west of the Alpine fault gives us the ability to track down that critical early record. It's only here to resolve those early stages of deformation which have also been lost from the system. So if you want an analogy, here is the Southern Alps, basically. Here's the Alpine fault structure is our wood chipper here. There's the Pacific plate going into that system, and very rapidly it's being stripped off by erosion, dumped off into the Tasman Sea. And here is the problem of trying to isolate that early record, and that you've had, as I said, well, this efficient erosion means that despite the fact you've had 80 kilometres of convergence through a 25 kilometre thick crustal package, there was no overthrusting of that to the Australian plate. So fast that all that uplift and convergence of the Pacific plates being taken care of by the erosion of that Grauwacke sequence. So of that 80 kilometres of convergence, it's all gone. It's eroded through, lifted up the Alpine fault, eroded off, dumped into the Tasman Sea. So you've lost 80 kilometre swathe of the pre-convergent system. All the structures, all the geology of that 80 kilometre sequence, eroded up, pushed over the Alpine fault, eroded off, gone. And it's this intensity of deformation. In fact, you've had all this push through your system, eroded off and lost from the sequence, gives you a challenge to try to isolate the early stages of evolution of that structural system, that early structural history. So rather than trying to look directly at evidence of the structural behaviour and what's left of the system here, I'm taking an oblique to run to try and do this, looking at the proxy record of orogenesis provided by the uplift and erosion taking place. And this is one of the dominant features of the orogenic system here, this rapid erosion, which is giving us the problem of losing that actual surface geology record. But along with that, if you think this through, that erosion is driven by that you're building up this orogenic topography. And so the relief you're creating is driving the erosion, and so the rates of erosion that you experience are therefore giving you a proxy record of the orogenic processes. The faster we create our topography, the faster we erode it off, and therefore if you look to the record of the changes in erosion rate and erosion distribution, that will give you an insight into the structural history of this system in a broad sense. We're tracking this through looking at how that changing erosion system influences the thermal history of particles that have lifted up and eroded through the system. So we're looking for thermal history of particles that are going through and experiencing that structural tectonic system of the Southern Alps here. So, and how are we doing this? Well, some of you are old enough to remember the 1980s campaign by Castrol, oils ain't oils, trying to convince you that, different types of oil do different things to your car. Well, the same is true of geochronology. Okay, this is a Castrol GTX, school of geochronology. Ages ain't ages. Different types of geochronology telling you different things about your system. And it's this variation away from a basic focus on one type of age gives us the ability to do some interesting things about dynamic behaviour in our geological systems. Any geochronologist will tell you a number is the easy part. You take a rock, you put it in your machine, press the button, you get a number. The challenge as a geologist is saying, well, what does that number mean about the geological system I'm studying? How does it relate to some fundamental character of the geological system, some process which I can relate to and see happening in my record? What we assume when we take the results of our analysis and do the maths to get an age is this. We assume closed system behaviour, that whenever we have our parent decay into our daughter, that's preserved, so the numbers that we see relate to this decay process taking place to change one to the other. Now, with many types of geochronometer, though, this is not a simple relationship. Lots of different types of mineral, we can gain or lose one of our materials here. We can gain our parent isotope or we can lose a daughter isotope from that system through a range of processes. And so a lot of different geochronometers, you'll find a lot of their history will actually be open systems. So what you see when you date a mineral is often not the age of that mineral from crystallization. It's some later aspect of the history of that system. Something's happened to that mineral after it's formed to then trap the isotopes, and it's that later event which we're really seeing when we date that mineral sample. Now, although this is complex, it gives us an opportunity. Because clearly, the system is giving us open system behavior. If some process in geology is giving us this behavior here where we're losing our isotopes, and that is later on changed and now we retain them, we go to a closed system, then that, whatever it was that changed us from open system to closed system behavior, that's what we're constraining when we look at the age of that system. Okay, so in doing that, if we have this complexity where something about our geological history is giving us this variation in behavior, then when we get an age, we're looking at that process. So there are a whole range of different things, different chronometers that can give us this open system behavior. So when you date a rock and look at what you get, what you see is a record of that dynamic process in some capacity. So rather than just telling you about crystallization, Windows geochronology. What do you want to know? Different dating systems constrain different parts of your geological history. You know, some ages give you crystallization, and clearly the king of the pile here is zircon UPB ages. They are almost always going to be crystallization age, and that's great. If you want that, that's what you go to. But there are other things that can also dynamically alter your isotopic record to give you variations in what you see in your ages. Strain can release isotopes from some mineral systems. Chemical exchange can take place without breaking down the crystal structure. You can re-equilibrate your isotopes across the crystal boundary to reset your age. Thermal history can allow isotopes to leak out of your system or into your system to change the age that you see. So if you know what's happening, if you know what can influence your different chronometers in these various ways, then looking at these different behaviors can be done by looking at a range of ages for one sample or for one region. And what we're doing in this study here is exploiting the fact that many chronometers are sensitive to temperature and using that to try and trace the record of the thermal history experienced by particles as they pass through this active orogenic system. So back to New Zealand. This is a lovely view here up the South Island to give you some reference here, looking up from the south here along the plate boundary to this big bend in the Alpine fault up in the northwest. So here's the very straight Alpine fault boundary coming up through the system, then jogging off to the left here around the mountains of the northern part of New Zealand. And so you can see that the topography I showed before, showing up in the system, off to the east of the boundary where you have the Pacific plate being thrust up and over that crustal ramp, you see the high mountainous topography here of those southern Alps. But out to the west, we see there are also some low mountains out here in a range of locations, and these are almost always granitic. These are the Gondwanan crystalline remnants of that system, which are a key part of the potential for geochronology here, because all these schists out on the eastern side, they're pretty hard to date. They're low uranium, they're low grade, they have very few minerals you can date in a way. They don't give you much of a signal. These granites, though, are very amenable. They're good things to date, full of nice minerals like zircon, apatite, micas, feldspar, great things to do a range of geochronology on. So what I'm focusing on in this study is looking at the geochronology of those granites out here in that less deformed west coast region of the Alpine system here. Now, I'm looking at a range of different types of age from these rocks that I've analysed. The dominant source of information is coming from argon analysis of K-feldspar. And the complexity of the K-feldspar structure gives rise to a range of diffusive behaviour. So if you analyse your samples carefully through a diffusive experiment, you can get some insight into the history of that sample over a range of temperatures, which can range from anywhere from 150 degrees at the lower end to as high as maybe 400, 450 degrees at the higher end. So if you look at these the ages of your feldspar in this way, you can get insight into thermal history across a broad range of the record of your sample. Along with that, I've also analysed uranium helium dating of zircon, which closes to retention of helium at about 200 degrees, which is at the lower end of the feldspar range, so it gives us I feel like an independent constraint of that lower history. And along with that, there's an apatite analysis there of fission track, which is, closes at around, sensitive to temperature change between about 120 degrees and 80 degrees at the lower end, and lower again, apatite helium dating of some samples there to give us temperature closure around 75 degrees or so. So a range of temperatures we're seeing constrained for these various chronometers to give us that record of thermal experience of these samples as they pass through, and are uplifted and eroded through that orogenic system. Now, with this range of temperature, giving us both an extension and calibration of that K-feldspar analysis, this near-surface loss of the record isn't such a problem anymore. I've lost all the surface geology here, it's been eroded away, but that's not a problem for me because I'm looking at records that are being set and are seeing behaviour down below the surface. So without that erosion, I wouldn't see anything in these ages. The fact that I've taken my system and I've lost the surface kilometre or 2 or 3 or 4 to erosion means I've now exposed records of change that are being tracked in that thermal history of those samples. So with that, it gives me an insight that I can now use these to track that cooling history and therefore that structural history using these chronometers. So looking at some examples of the kind of data we're looking at here, this is a view from one of these west coast mountains, these low granite hills off to the west of the Alpine fault boundary. So I'm looking from the summit of this mountain south across the plate boundary. There's the Alpine fault, hills over here. The Southern Alps themselves are concealed by cloud here. They ramp up to about 2.5, 3 kilometres at this point in the orogenic system. So here's your high topography of the mountain ranges here. Here are these low, rounded granitic hills that everywhere along the west coast. Everywhere you see a mountain here, it's usually a granite. These are great, giving you an ability to sample and look at the range of ages you're seeing along the system in some detail. And critically here in this location, this is why I'm showing this particular slide here, out west of the Alpine fault there is a second subparallel fault called the Fraser fault. Now, these for a long time were somewhat enigmatic in New Zealand's geological history because, you know, being part of this plate boundary, a lot of these structures that were predating the Alpine fault have been transposed into subparallel orientations with respect to the Alpine fault boundaries. What it used to be is hard to assay directly, but here you see locally you have these faults here, west of the Alpine fault, that usually define a little lozenge between these faults and the Alpine fault, where you see much higher grade metamorphics here. Out west here you're seeing lower green schist facies and even lower. In the little lozenge here between these two fault structures, you're seeing higher grade up to sort of upper amphibolite facies, even higher. So this is clearly a domain of higher uplift between these two faults here. So looking at the ages that we see, looking to the west of the Fraser fault here in the western part of the system, here is the results of one of these K-feldspar dating experiments. And what we see, looking at the range of ages we see during the diffusion experiment, the minimum ages are around 8 million years. We see in the early parts of the release here. But as you heat that sample up to higher and higher temperatures, we see age increasing through that record to 75, 80 million years in the early parts of its history here. So you see this range of ages exposed through that sample's argon release pattern. If we compare that to a sample taken between the Alpine and Fraser faults, here we see same granitic character, but here we're seeing basically a higher grade, deeper slice exposed by that fault system there. Again, I've shown these with the same scale to them, so you can immediately compare the ages that you see. And although you get the same minimum ages at around 8 million years through the system here, the maximum ages for this second sample don't get any higher than about 25 million years through this sequence there. So if I look now at the implications of these release patterns here through looking at the thermal history they indicate, these results you see here are basically a forward modelling process to try and capture what this age spectrum tells us about thermal history. It's trying to match the observed diffusion characteristics and age release that you see in each sample by trying to model that behaviour from a process-based perspective. So what you see here, basically, the darker you see a point in this display here, the more commonly it shows up in the thermal history models that fit data. So there is no single unique history you can invert these ages to give you, but looking at probabilities, you can say what are the most likely things that come out of thermal histories that you see that can fit your data. You see here's the original age spectrum for this sample here, and in grey here, these are the model spectra that are produced by the histories that you see exposed in this diagram. So what this shows us then is each of these samples gives us two major periods of cooling that are constrained by what we see in the sample's behaviour. For this sample here between the Alpine and Fraser faults, those cooling episodes take place here in the early Miocene. We see cooling taking place required to satisfy the observed age spectra. And again, then things calm down for a lot of time between early Miocene and the latest Miocene, early Pliocene, when we start seeing cooling taking place again, which kicks off and takes us through the constraint of our lower temperature helium ages as well towards the eventual exposure of those samples to the surface. The basic character you see in the western sample out in the Mount Tahua, again you see two episodes. There is an earlier phase of cooling. In this case it's a Cretaceous cooling episode we see. It is required to explain the older ages we see in that sample there. And then again, things quieten down. You don't see much happening. You lose all your constraint between there and again this later phase of cooling in the late Miocene, early Pliocene period, kicking off down to the exposure of that sample at the surface. So what you see then is these two samples give us these two phases of cooling, but only one of those phases is shared. But they both had this most recent phase of cooling beginning about 8 to 10 million years and taking us through to the modern exposure of those samples. And this, of course, correlates to the modern phase of orogeny. This is the same timing as we see giving us the initiation of convergence. So it's no surprise you see this age here. This is when we began to see rapid uplift taking place across most of the South Island. So he's in that record of the recent orogenesis taking place showing up in these samples. It's that early record, though, that gives us the interesting parts of what we're seeing here. Because one of these samples experiences cooling in the Miocene. This sample doesn't. In fact, if you look at the complementary records, this sample was being buried at the same time. So one side of the fault's being uplifted and eroded. Another sample just across the fault boundary here is seeing burial, substantial burial and reheating at the same time. And you see the same record showing up wherever you see these minor fault structures. We have a number of these different minor little fault lozenges along the Alpine fault here to the west, Granite Hill Fault, the Fraser Fault. There are some minor ones further south as well. These little isolated faults now sub-parallel to the Alpine fault boundary, but originally were in a range of geometries we can't really constrain very well now, but these things are now giving us these little independent little fault blocks trapped against the Alpine fault here by the recent deformation. Wherever you have these little fault boundaries, you see the same bimodal record. Within those fault blocks, you see the same history of these guys experienced uplift in the Miocene and in the recent past as well. Out to the west of those, wherever you have samples from the granites west of those fault boundaries, you see no evidence of this Miocene uplift. In fact, Miocene shows and burial of those areas. So these fault boundaries appear to be significant in the early stages of the development of that plate boundary. That they see a reactivation, kicking off of uplift, substantial uplift across that boundary taking place coincident with the change in tectonics of the New Zealand region. So if you put those histories together, what you see then is you have these two different styles of behaviour showing up on the West Coast region. And this is what you see wherever you look at these samples. There is one of these two behaviours. Within those little fault lozenges, you see your basement gneisses are uplifted dramatically during that early Miocene period. Then things go quiet for a while, and then you see rapid uplift. Outside those little fault blocks, you see history where often you capture the early stages of rifting of New Zealand away from the Australian block. Sometimes you don't see that this preserved locally. It's the major feature you see in these samples. And again, things then quieten down after that Cretaceous period. Not much happens for a while. And then in the Miocene, these things get buried by that the sediments coming off the little blocks dropping up in the Miocene period. And again, these things unify then in the modern phase of uplift here. So what you see then is this dramatic change across these little fault boundaries, the little fault structures that exist west of the Alpine fault system. And basically this is consistent with the kind of behaviour we'd expect to see. We know that this early boundary propagating through the New Zealand region was basically a transform structure linking up two subduction zones. Propagating a new structure boundary through your region here, we've reactivated a number of structures. Locally, the things are complex, so where they are giving rise to local domains of overlapping of fault segments or other complexity, we're getting uplift and erosion taking place, but next door you've also got areas where you're getting things dropping down, sedimentation taking place, local basins forming. So this is consistent with the behaviour we expect to see in a complex strike-slip system developing through the southern margin of New Zealand here. Now, the interesting thing in terms of that evolution is that this doesn't continue. We see these blocks here giving synchronous uplift and erosion taking place in the early Miocene, but it doesn't last very long. And in fact, it lasts only about 2 or 3 million years in most of these records that we have. And then things go quiet for these blocks. They don't see any more uplift until we hit the modern phase of orogenic uplift later on in the later Miocene. So what that means is, we know that the major points of change tectonically are at 25 and 8. Between those two periods, things are consistent. We have the same regime of strike-slip dynamics through the New Zealand region from 25 through to 8. So what happens is you see an initial kick-off of these structures all at the same time. They all kick off at the same 25 million year point in time. And all the ones we have left here on the west coast, they all die out within a few million years, and then things go very quiet until we hit the modern phase of tectonic change in the later Miocene. We see the same behaviour if you step out of the actively deforming plate boundary zone and look further to the south, where you have less deformation in the remnants of the wider South Island. There are some inherited structures out here further to the south that preserve some more subtle uplift histories, but still see the same kind of timing showing up. So what we're seeing is not unique to the west coast region. You can see the same thing showing up in structures out here further away from the plate boundary in the wider eastern parts of the South Island. And this in particular is coming from the work of Steve White, who's currently working at GSWA, I believe, where he's looking at the history of the Moonlight Tectonic Zone and the Siberia Fault Zone down here in sort of Western Otago and Fiordland out here in the western regions of New Zealand. And again, the important thing about this slide is not the detail here, but you see that here is the fault zone we're talking about here. It's not a single structure. It's a complex series of overstepping minor fault segments and inherited little bits and pieces that are part of an early inherited tectonic system that's been reactivated several times through its history. And this complex network of faults has been hit by the same Miocene new plate boundary system and responded in the same way that we're seeing out in those western samples in the high-grade gneisses of the west coast region. So looking down here, this is looking down the barrel of that Moonlight Tectonic Zone in sort of the western Otago. So here you see all these little nick points in the ranges here. This is this fault moving down through the picture here. And it's not a straight knife-edge boundary. These are little segments that are not quite lined up, so it's complex. It steps across to the left and to the right. Look at the history of these things. That inherited fault system was, again, it was a rift fault system from the Cretaceous rifting of New Zealand from Australia, reactivated in the early Miocene transpressional development of the new plate boundary in the Miocene. And what happened when it hit this inherited structure was you saw early on intense but short-lived uplift on some of these structures, so local sedimentation and basin formation, all very complex local geography. But these things stopped within a few million years. So again, that early record is seen as complexity and reactivation of structures, but this reactivation is very, very short-lived. It doesn't last very long along this whole domain of activity. So what we're seeing, that if I try and piece that together and show you an indication of what's happening tectonically across this region, stepping back to before the modern plate boundary developed, this is about 30 million years, where prior to the evolution of the modern transform boundary, we had basically, this is the inherited structure of that rifted Gondwanan remnant carried away from Australia. About 30 million years ago, there was a proto-rift propagating through here from the south. Challenger rift was progressively breaking up into the interior of the Kemble Plateau here. But this failed, and then this gave us the setup for what was going to happen with the subsequent evolution of the system. So I'm showing here a few bits of geography just to get your eye in. Here's the modern west coast of the South Island here. Here's the east coast region of the South Island, where prior to the plate boundary development, this is for the basic geography that we had for the system here. Key features, one of the major marker beds in that Mesozoic accretionary sequence is this ophiolite belt through central New Zealand here. So this was previously a record of an ophiolite hitting the Gondwana margin, giving us this nice marker horizon through the sequence here. Here is the East Fiordland, as you know the geography here, just to give you some pictures of what's going to happen as we begin to move this system around and we change the tectonics. Key thing is, at this point in time, the polar rotation of the two plates is sitting here within the Kemble Plateau, within that New Zealand structure. So what happens in 25 million years is that polar rotation jumps off to the south, and this then sets up that transform dynamic through the central part of the South Island here. So what you have then is you have all inherited structures. You have these former rift structures that were linked to the rifting from Australia and to the Challenger rift system coming through here. And you've also got these boundaries that are structures that are parallel to that previous accretionary margin here. So you've got two sort of orientations of structure within that sequence, which are then hit by this new tectonic phase when we begin to have a transform boundary going through at about 25 million years. And the key thing here for this story is where we're going to find what we see today on the west coast. These are the Fraser faults and Granite Hill faults, those ones that are left preserved hanging against the Alpine fault boundary in our modern geology. And out here is where we have things like the Moonlight fault system and the Siberia fault system out in sort of western Otago. And so here's the range of deformation we're seeing across that sequence. There's a very broad domain here, maybe 100 kilometres wide, of deformation of things that are being reactivated in this early stages of response to that new plate boundary system. So all these faults begin to reactivate in this regime because they're all misoriented. None of them are the right orientation for the new regime. And so as we hit it with our initial stages of deformation, it jostles around. These little blocks begin to pop up left and right. And so we see an adjustment of that inherited geology to the imposed deformation forces on that boundary. And so within a few million years, though, that all dies away and we form this very coherent structure here as things adjust and we take our strain on a single structure. The Alpine fault evolves as a through-going strike-slip boundary, and all these other faults here die out. So they're now rapidly giving up deformation. They're still preserved there as these markers within the sequence, but as we deform that system, they begin to be transposed into the same orientation as the Alpine faults. We lose their independent orientation, and they lose their character and begin to basically transform into that orientation of the modern plate boundary. And then, of course, the key thing is, at 8 million years, we then change our dynamics again. The polar rotation jumps further to the south, and we impose our new deformation across the plate boundary. We eat up all that record. So most of those faults that were reactivated during the early stages of the plate boundary's development get thrust up over the Alpine fault and lost. We have just these few records left, the little west coast faults out here and the Otago faults here to the east. But again, these are basically you now get a very compressed, narrow zone of deformation preserved against the deformed plate boundary. Most of the records have been lost by that transposition and uplift and erosion. Now, the interesting thing about this behaviour is that that activity which we see, that widespread activity we see across all these structures, 25 million years, doesn't last very long. The tectonic stays the same between 25 million years and 8 million years. Nothing changes in the driving forces, but the response of the geology changes. So we see initially a broad domain of deformation and local uplift taking place, but then rapidly that all dies away. And so we see this change in the structural response of the South Island must be driven by something else. Most of these structures die out within about million years, those that we see left behind anyway in the records that we have today. Maybe the other ones were longer living, but we don't see those preserved in the modern records. And I think this is an example, as I'll show you in a second, of we're seeing self-organization. The complex geometry of that initial structural system, as we'll see, evolves from that complexity, and as we deform it, you naturally evolve a simpler, more coherent bounding structure, which then absorbs the deformation. This is a natural expectation of structural evolution. Now, if I explore this here through some modelling work, this is the work of colleague Jiajun Feng from the University of Toulouse, where he's done some models for me looking at the behaviour we expect to see if we have this inheritance effect influencing how our crust deforms here. So we've got two crustal blocks to compare the deformation. So one's got a homogeneous upper crustal rheology, the other one's got these inherited structures that are weak zones within the model. Just to see what happens if you have, if you hit this complex inherited geology with a new regime of deformation. And the interesting, the behaviours that we see are interesting in terms of what they show us about the relative character or influence of these kind of inherited weaknesses on the way our system evolves. So here's our two examples here. So here's the early stages of deformation. Without any kind of influencing structure, we see the structures that develop are all, as you expect, in optimal orientation with respect to the driving forces. We see you evolve some zones of strain parallel to the shearing forces that you're imposing here, and there's a wide distribution of deformation early on here across the whole model. Where you've got those inherited weaknesses, though, the structures that we see are quite different. So rather than distributing deformation across the whole system, things are much more focused early on. So the fact you have the weaknesses focuses deformation onto these structures. So rather than distributing a deformation, you see a focus onto those inherited structures. You also see some influence here of the new regime. You can see some of these structures growing in small part parallel to the imposed deformation, but you also see locally these inherent structures taking a lot of the strain. They're giving you a very dramatic increase in the focus of strain early on in that system's evolution. As we evolve the system further on, progressively those active structures get transposed towards the imposed deformation orientation, and naturally those structures that are favourably oriented grow at the expense of others. So progressively we move from this complex domain of focused deformation towards converging with the natural imposed deformation of the system here. And as you go further on, this becomes stronger and stronger until eventually we focus deformation on a single structure. Everything else is lost from the deforming system there. So the key thing is, although these things end up looking pretty much the same, the early deformation stages is different because you have that focus on those early structures. That they act to give you a localized deformation where you see these weaknesses in the system. And so that they give you a broad distribution of intense deformation rather than initially a broad deformation which then focuses. Why is it important, this kind of behaviour? What does it do for us geologically? Well, I guess that the key thing that's when I was looking at this was what does a structure look like if it's going to do useful mineralization for us? What are the things you look for in a structure if you're trying to find one that looks good for you as a mineralization host? You look for things like misoriented structures that are not oriented properly with respect to the modern stress regime, or whatever it was that was going off when this thing was mineralizing. Because these are the ones that are likely to have things like fault valving and large focus of fluid flow and those sorts of things. Things like irregular structures, lots of jogs and oversteps and other complexity, which will give rise to a higher latency and a focus of mineralization and complex damage zones. So these are the kind of properties that make things look interesting and juicy from a structural point of view if you're looking for control of mineralization through structural processes. So this kind of complexity that we see in the early stages of evolution of response of the geology to this new plate boundary environment is the kind of thing that you expect to give you a good ore formation environment. In the very earliest days after we changed the regime and hit our region with a new dynamic, that's when you see a lot of reactivation of strange structures that are oriented in a range of ways. You see a lot of adjustment, a lot of deformation, a lot of things that are being jostled around and they're not comfortable. They're readjusting to the modern regime. Once you evolve your mature structure, which is in a right orientation, it's efficient, it's well lubricated by gouge and other evolved systems. This is less attractive as a focus of mineralization. It doesn't give you the same complexity, the same degree of difficulty in deforming, and so it doesn't give you the same potential for the kind of progressive release of major stored fluid in a rupture event, those kinds of things. So chances are, as you evolve from this early stage through to your more mature structure, you're likely to lose a lot of the attractiveness of your system as a focus of mineralization. Which, this kind of behavior may explain why we see a short-lived but widespread character to a lot of mineralization episodes within broad camp environments. It's no accident that you see, either 25 million years or 15 million years in the Carlin trend, gold mineralization. You don't see in between those two. Those are the times when you hit the system with a new tectonic regime, it adjusts, and then the mineralization dies away again. So this kind of behavior of initial adjustment and complexity giving rise to the attractive mineralization stage where you're seeing focused deformation on these structures across a broad region may give us this kind of interesting behavior where we're seeing a very widely distributed synchronous mineralization taking place within a potential environment. So some conclusions. What I think I hope I've shown you here is that in this hard to constrain setting, thermochronology, looking at the thermal histories of these deeply exhumed samples, gives us a useful means to evaluate the dynamics. So we see records in histories that we don't see anywhere else in the system because they are showing us behavior deeper in the crust that's now been exposed by that erosion at the surface there. So where you have high deformation, high exhumation, these kinds of thermal histories give you a window into that history which you've lost from the surface. For this area here, the Southern Alps, this allows us to recognize what otherwise are cryptic domains of behavior. You don't see these records anywhere else. So our ability to look at that thermal history variation allows us to recognize that these structures that today are subparallel to the Alpine fault originally are much more complex beasts that tell us something different about the early evolution of that plate boundary. And the record that they show us indicates that all of these complex array of structures across this domain, this region, all went off at the same time when we hit the South Island with a new tectonic regime 25 million years. And that gives us a very short-lived phase of adjustment to that transformed boundary. That rapid cessation of activity as these things died off within 2 or 3 million years basically reflects the rapid evolution of a more coherent, efficient plate boundary along the modern Alpine fault. So all those other guys who were off in the periphery of the region died out. We focus all the deformation onto that modern plate boundary structure. So this is a rapid phase of adjustment to that new imposition. And maybe it's a thought exercise for the end of the discussion here. This kind of behavior, this early focused deformation collapsing down rapidly to a single structure within a few million years, may give us an insight into why we see these kinds of synchronous camp evolution of mineral deposits. Because it's that early stage of complexity across a broad region gives you an ability to mineralize across everything that's being hit by the same phase of deformation, but then rapidly that'll all turn off again. So you won't see these things being long-lived structures. They'll give you a short burst of mineralization when you hit the regime with a new imposed driving force. And we'll finish there and take any questions about those ideas.